Well, good afternoon. I'm Doug Sinclair, Executive Vice President of Programs, Chief Medical Officer here at St. Michael's Hospital. I'd like to welcome you all to the fourth annual lecture of Louis L. Odette Family Urban Angel Fund for Homeless People. So welcome everyone, very exciting day. So St. Michael's Hospital is, of course, we have lots of roles. We're a trauma center, we're a tertiary care referral center, a research center, and a fully affiliated teaching hospital working at the University of Toronto. But we know we're an inner city hospital and very tuned in and linked to our local neighborhood. We're known, of course, as the Urban Angel. We work very hard at being inclusive, trying to do a better job of that, and working hard with our local community, both in a care way and actually, what's very exciting, is also an educational research. We're very proud of that tradition. It goes back a long years, and we're very proud of it. So October the 10th marks World Homeless Day. It's also World Mental Health Day. And the link between these two days is unfortunately well established. And again, it makes today's lecture even more timely. So in 2013, St. Michael's received an unprecedented donation to endow the Louis L. Odette Family Trust Fund, the fund and the Fund for Homeless people, and this lecture is a very important part of it. The support of the Odette family is vital to the continuation of our innovative work that you're going to hear lots about this afternoon. It's great to see representatives of the family here. Lou and Paul, thank you for your great work. I'm glad you could be here today. The endowment also it funds today's lecture by an outstanding person in the area of homelessness to highlight progress on improving the lives of people experiencing chronic homelessness. And because of the family's generosity, we are able to present an internationally renowned leader in this area, Dr. James OConnell, and hear about his work helping people who are experiencing homelessness. Now I'd like to call Dr. Tom Ungar, our psychiatrist in chief at St. Michael's. He'll be sharing a little more about the first program development developed through the Odette Fund. Tom.
Good afternoon, everybody. Nice to meet all of you. My name is Tom Unger. I'm the new psychiatrist-in-chief here at St. Michael's Hospital. I joined June 1st, and I'm thoroughly enjoying it and thrilled with my choice. What they say about St. Mike's is true. Very briefly, I recall walking in on one of my first days, seeing a homeless person outside, probably asleep, perhaps more than asleep. And what I would be used to seeing is seeing security called and walking out half hour later and them not being there. Instead, what I saw was an hour later, a blanket, a sandwich, and a warm drink beside them. And that was indicative of why I'm here and the hospital. So I'd like to say a special thank you to the Odette family for their exceptional support of St. Michael's Hospital, which I'm fortunate to now be joining. The first project developed through their Family Urban Angel Fund for Homeless People is the STAR Learning Center, STAR standing for Supporting Transitions and Recovery. STAR is an adult education program in Canada's first education recovery center. I'd like to recognize my predecessor, Dr. Vicky Sturgiopoulos, a former psychiatrist-in-chief and a scientist with us here at the St. Michael's Center for Urban Health Solutions, for her vision in creating STAR. A recovery education center is a new approach of promoting wellness and community integration through education rather than through traditional health services. It's gaining prominence in the United States, the UK, and in Canada. STAR's focuses on supporting the transition of current or former housing insecure individuals with chronic health conditions into successful housing tenure. The program also hopes to help individuals attain wellness, educational, and vocational goals. In April 2014, STAR hosted its first workshop, and over the past 3 years, the program has grown tremendously. STAR has enrolled over 500 people and hosted close to 600 workshops to date. Really remarkable numbers. STAR is being seen as a model. Knowledge of the program and its success have spread around the world with interested agencies from far as away as Ireland and Australia. And thanks to the Odette family's generosity, STAR has been able to leverage their donation to receive an annual contribution in addition of $74,000 from the Toronto Central LHIN, a one-time $25,000 grant from the Bell Let's Talk Community Fund, and in addition, Dr. Sturgiopoulos received a $400,000 grant from the Canadian Institutes of Health Research, CIHR, that'll be used and is currently being used to undertake the program evaluation. STAR is giving people the resources they need to reintegrate with the wider community. STAR members are in the audience today, and we're so pleased to have them here. Welcome. Nice wave of you, that's great. And with GV's assistance, I would now like to turn your attention to a short video presentation sharing the experiences of 2 STAR members, Scott and Amber.
I've had a bit of a struggle with my life from the get-go. I was 10 years old, taken from my mother and put into the foster care system. I didn't really have much of, I guess you would say, a life at that point. I was struggling mentally. I was pretty much a rat, giving medication, things like that. And I finally decided as soon as I was 18 to sign out of the care. I come here to Canada, which I was in the state of Georgia first. And I got stuck up in the streets. Ended up homeless, fighting, drugs, and in and out of jail constantly for all of those things.
Hi, my name is Scott. I became newly homeless at age 54 after leading a mostly productive life doing business startups. I was introduced to STAR Learning Center, met Brian, the program director, on a Tuesday at 11 a.m. and within 3 hours I was doing CrossFit training on Riverdale Park, that big incline running up and down and doing circuits. A day later, Brian had hooked me up with a resource to get a free bike. A week after that, I was also doing food deliveries and making revenue, exercising daily. So STAR has helped me develop my primary tools, which have led to the secondary tree benefits.
And so I took it way too far, and I decided it was time for a change, get off the repeating cycle. And through a friend of mine, I was introduced to the STAR program, who I then met up with Brian. He is amazing. He's worked with me at Covenant House for many, many years. He's also was a boss of mine through a culinary program called Cooking for Life. Through that, me and Brian has formed this relationship, and he's gotten me into all kinds of programs. Thoughts and emotions, anger management, things like that, fitness programs, gyms, free gym memberships. Employment
And volunteer prep, facilitation courses, getting a better future. There's mindfulness coming up. So these are all great courses that are helping me re-examine, rebuild my toolbox and help me just make some decisions on what's next for me, what's my next chapter, and certainly getting me on the path to a happier and better life.
Officially been a year. I have had no charges. I finally have housing, and it was because of the support from the STAR program and all these programs. It's kept me out of trouble, kept me focused, and helped me learn more about myself and the way I think, the way I handle myself, and know that there's also people dealing with the same issues and that we all can, manage and we can help each other. It's just about if you want it.
And in any small, mid-size or large corporation, the most important part of a business is the human capital. They're the best assets, the greatest assets, and the most telling. STAR nails it in terms of the human capital. Brian, the director, has put together an incredible team of people here that are totally dedicated and devoted.
Without this program, I would literally be in jail. So without them, I wouldn't have a home, I wouldn't have a better life, and I wouldn't have been able to focus. From yesterday to today, I'm a totally different person, and that's because of the support of STAR. And that is my story for today.
So a special thank you to Scott and Amber for sharing their experiences with us. I'd now like to call upon Dr. Stephen Wong, Director of the Center for Urban Health Solutions and Chair Homelessness, Housing and Health at St. Michael's Hospital, to say a few words. Few people are as qualified to speak on the matter of caring for those experiencing disadvantage and marginalization as Dr. Wong. He's devoted his research and his career to addressing homelessness through his research and his clinical work. And he has said, quote, "In order to have a healthy city and healthy country, we don't leave people behind. We work to ensure that we thrive as a whole as Canadians." Please join me in welcoming Dr. Stephen Wong.
Hi, everyone. It's my privilege to introduce Dr. OConnell. I just want to say it's really an honor to be a member of the interdisciplinary team of researchers, clinicians, and other service providers and experts at St. Michael's Hospital who are all dedicated to addressing the issue of homelessness and to helping those who are among the most marginalized and disadvantaged in our society. The Center for Urban Health Solutions is really privileged to partner with STAR and other programs like it to increase our collective impact at the local and national level, and also to seek solutions that can really make our city and our country a better place, and to live up to the motto of our center, which is that we believe in a fair society where everyone can thrive. I'm going to just say a few words about Jim, first by mentioning a few highlights from his remarkable career. So Dr. OConnell founded the Boston Healthcare for the Homeless program, and the first medical respite program in the world in Boston in 1985. He actually pioneered the development of the first electronic medical record for a program for homeless people back in 1995, when electronic medical records were rare for any healthcare program. He was the National Program Director of the Homeless Families Program for the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation and the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. He received the prestigious Albert Schweitzer Humanitarian Award in 2012, and he's also the author of a book, Stories from the Shadows, Reflections of a Street Doctor, that was published in 2015, that draws upon his experiences as a physician caring for people who are homeless in Boston for more than 30 years. And those of you attending here will have a chance to receive a copy of that book. So on a more personal note, I just want to mention that Jim and I go way back. In fact, I would not be in the area of providing care for people who are homeless and a researcher in this area if it were not for Jim, who took me in as a inexperienced young physician, just having graduated from my training, and having the opportunity to work with him at the Boston Healthcare for the Homeless program. And what I can say from my experience there is that it is an extraordinary organization, and above all, it's an extraordinary organization because at the heart of it is Dr. OConnell, who brings an incredible warmth, compassion, expertise, and wisdom in caring for people who are experiencing homelessness. And he is as comfortable discussing homelessness research, housing policy, as he is, most importantly, at the heart of what he does on the streets of Boston, providing care for people who are living in the rough. And so he is truly a world expert in this area, and it's really an honor to have him to speak with us today. Dr. OConnell.
So, Stephen, thank you very much. And I was thinking as Stephen was mentioning that he came and worked with us, you have to understand that we were pretty much working alone back in 1992, and Stephen came to us like a breath of fresh air. If any of you have had a chance to work with him, you know that nothing is quite the same after he's come and shared things with you. So I think our program got more than a huge boom from Stephen's presence. So I wanted to say thank you. By the way, by word of caution, when you get that book, I'm from an Irish Catholic family, and my brother is a lawyer, okay? And he will tell you that this is the best book ever written, okay? And the reason he thinks it's the best book ever written, as he explains to all of his friends in great detail, is that he keeps it by his bedside table. And whenever he can't sleep, he picks it up. And he says, to this day, I've never gotten past 2 pages before I was right back asleep. So just fair warning to you guys, okay? But second, I'm like entirely honored to be here today. I don't even know where to begin to say, one, thank you for getting me out of Boston on the day after we lost, the Red Sox lost, and on a rainy day, so thank you for that. But I don't think in my entire time working in homelessness, I've ever seen an angel fund for making people aware of homelessness, and it actually takes my breath away. So to the Odette family, you are awesome. It's just remarkable that people would do that. The other thing I would love to say is that, in thinking about what to say today, I just pulled out some of the slides and pictures. So I have a lot of pictures, okay, not many words. In fact, I don't think there's any words, maybe a couple. Just to show you some of the experiences that we had in Boston. And please remember, I've learned this in going around, that each city has to address this problem depending on what's going on in each city. So some things will translate, some things will not. Some are going to be American related and not Canadian, and I apologize for that in advance. But let me start with this first slide, and I don't know if it helps to turn the front slides, you can see that, I hope. So to go way back, I had no intention of becoming a doctor for homeless people, by the way. I wanted to be an oncologist. I was interested in end-of-life care, palliative care, and I was going to do a fellowship after I was finishing my residency at Mass General. But it turned out in 1985, the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation gave about 19 cities these grants to try to go out and take care of homeless people in each city. And Boston was one of the cities to get one of those grants. And the community that was there, the community of stakeholders who the foundation had required to be involved, which included homeless people and homeless advocates, decided they wanted full-time doctors. They did not want part-time doctors. Interesting concept. And so they couldn't find one. And so my chief of medicine, speaking of this when you were speaking, my chief of medicine called me in March of my senior year. I'm a few months away from going to my fellowship. And sort of described for me what he thought I should do. And any of you who have ever been into your chief of medicine's office, these questions are entirely rhetorical. And so, valuing my career, I said, of course, I'd take a year off. And I thought this was going to be my year of Urban Peace Corps or like AmeriCorps and just go take care of people. Little was I prepared for what was coming my way. My last job at MGH, at Mass General Hospital, where I trained, was to be the senior resident running the ICU. And for those of you who suffered through doctors like us, you get this incredibly inflated sense of ego by the time you've run the ICU. My sister, who's a nurse, will describe to you how insufferable we become. So I finished that, and that was June, and on July 1st, I went down to the shelter, Pine Street Inn, which is our largest shelter in Boston. It has about 700 beds for men and women, and I was going to be the doctor in the clinic. And so I walked in thinking, well, I just ran the ICU for a whole month. How tough can it be working in a shelter clinic? So I walked in, and the first thing I ran into was this phalanx of nurses, okay? Are there any nurses here, by the way, I hope? Because this is all about nursing, okay? So my talk today is a tribute to you, all right? So I walked in thinking they were going to be thrilled. I was the first doctor to have a full-time job doing this. I'm walking in. It's my first full-time job, too, as a doctor. And they sat me down on one of those little tables, you know, the ones that you used to have in school where there's an arm that comes out like this. I was always left-handed, and that arm was always on the right side. And they told me that they had been taking care of homeless people for about 15 years in the shelter without the help of doctors or hospitals, thank you very much, and that I would do well to listen to what they had to say. So they took away my stethoscope, they took away all my doctor stuff, all my tools, and they made me soak feet for 2 months. That was all I could do. And I can remember thinking I could be doing my oncology fellowship now, and I'm soaking feet down at the shelter. And this was one of the gentlemen whose feet I had to soak. And it was probably the best thing that ever happened to me. Because first of all, it told me the nurses, when they called people in, they always called them by their name. They'd say, Mr. Smith, come right in, or Mr. Williams, come in, can we soak your feet? And what I had not realized up until that point is that most of these folks never have anyone say their name with any kind of dignity. And so to offer that is gracious and really breaks spells. And so people come in, I notice these people kind of light up and be very proud. They'd come and have their feet soaked because it's kind of comforting, you know, and they've been standing in lines all day, walking around. And I had to soak feet, and I realized that, one, the magic of calling somebody by name, but two, this is flipping the power structure. So you're sitting at somebody's feet, and they're sitting up there, way away from the person, you're way away from their personal space. It's brilliant, okay? I thought it was awful at first. I started to realize the brilliance only after a few weeks. And this man, who I had seen in the emergency room at Mass General dozens, if not hundreds of times, was a man who we got to know because he was brought in all the time, very angry that he had been brought in by EMS or the police, would sit in an exam room, refuse to do anything that we said, and we had written in the chart that he had suffered from paranoid schizophrenia, but he was treatment resistant. And we kind of gave up on him. And he had these terribly swollen legs that would get infected. He wouldn't take the antibiotics, and it was a nightmare. So Barbara McGinnis, who was a nurse that was making me do this, made me soak his feet. And so I remember after about a month, looked down at me and he said, and remember now, the nurses had put me in the same spot as a homeless person. No one in a month called me doctor. I was unknown to be a doctor. But he looked down at me and said, hey, I heard you were a doctor. And I kind of lit up and I said, yes, I am a doctor. And then he goes, well, what the hell are you doing soaking feet? And I didn't know what to say in response to that, except, in the back of my mind, and to the nurses again, I said, I honestly don't know what I'm doing soaking feet, but I do whatever the nurses tell me. And he kind of laughed. I'd never seen him laugh. He laughed because all the time he had been at Pine Street, he'd also did exactly what the nurses told him to do. So he looked at me and he said, you're a smart man. And then, not to belabor it, about a week later, he asked me if I could give him something to help him sleep. He was having a lot of trouble sleeping at night. A couple weeks later, he asked for a little bit more medication. And I gave it to him. And then pretty soon, within about a month, he was taking all of the medicines that we had spent 25 years at Mass General saying he was resistant to taking. And I can remember the nurses going like this, saying, see, this is what we're talking about. That nothing changes in the lives of many of the very, very chronically homeless folks unless you have time to sit and get to know them, unless you can be present, unless you can just let them know you're not moving anywhere, you're there for them, and it's on their terms. A really hard lesson for someone who had been trained as we were in the really hectic pace of an academic teaching hospital in the middle of the city, where if I hadn't seen 4 or 5 people in an hour, somebody was knocking on my door to see if I could hurry up a little bit. So it was a real lesson, and I will forever cherish the nurses for that. And just to add a little background to this, even though it sounds kind of biblical, if you look in this is a fresco in Siena in Italy, and I think it goes back to the 600s or something like that. And there is the physician at the time soaking feet. So it's not a new idea, and maybe something we should go back to, as the nurses would insist. The other thing that I was trying to do was explain to I'm coming in and I have to show the nurses and the staff that I'm good. But it's hard to show that you're good in a shelter. It's a very chaotic world. So this man came in one night to me. His name was Amerigo. And I'll never forget this. He came in to me and he's this real character. He was a lot of fun and he was always laughing, having a good time. But he came to me really seriously and he said, Doc, you have to do something. He said, I can't swallow my vodka. I hadn't heard that chief complaint before, but it was worrisome because why was it? And so I asked, what's going on? And he said, well, Doc, I haven't been able to swallow food for months. He said, but I could always get my vodka down, so I was okay. He said, but yesterday I tried to swallow and it won't go down. And so, not surprisingly, when we did the workup, he had a huge tumor in the middle of his esophagus. He couldn't swallow anything past it. It was beyond resecting. It was beyond any kind of palliative chemotherapy. So I had to talk to him about that he really had a cancer that was maybe gave him another month or 2 to live. We put a tube in so we could feed him bypassing his esophagus. And then I spent a whole weekend, I remember I'm young and avid, before computers and stuff, spent a whole weekend filling out all the forms and visiting nursing homes to try to get him the appropriate nursing home to do good end-of-life care. And I found one in South Boston where he was from. And they agreed to admit him. And so I brought him down on Monday and got him into the nursing home, really proud of myself. And I said, look, this is a really wonderful place. They're going to take good care of you. It overlooked the water. And I was really proud of myself. So I went back to the shelter, and a week later, I'm coming into Pine Street, and there's a long alley to get into Pine Street, and there's a wall all along here where the men frequently sit. This is on the men's side, not the women's side. And I could hear all this raucous laughter, and I could hear his voice, and I was trying to figure out, what's going on? So I walked down there, and there he was, sitting on the wall with all his friends, laughing away, and he's got this half gallon of vodka, and he's pouring it into his tube. And I was like, I wanted to kill him. I said, Amerigo, this is not what we're supposed to do. And he looked at me, and then he read me the riot act, because he said, look, Doc, he said, I've been out here for 25 years. He said, these are my friends. These are the people I live around. He said, you put me in that nursing home. He said, thank you for all the work, but nobody was talking to one another. I didn't know anybody, and people were either watching TV or staring out the window. He said, I felt awful. So he came back to the shelter. And so I can remember the reason I cherish this picture is the nurses agreed we would do end-of-life care at the shelter. This is back in 1985, and they fed him each day through the tube. And he stayed at the shelter till literally the night before he died, dying in the way he wanted to die, but which in my mind was probably the worst way to die. So I had to learn that, we had to get used to different things. And then in trying to prove that I'm good, this man came in one night, And the staff was worried about him. I said, he looks okay to me. I mean, he didn't look okay. He has scabies there. If you look really carefully, he's got a skin cancer right in front of his ear. He's obviously been drinking too much. He smokes too much. His name was Jack. He became a patient of mine for years. And he was like, Doc, I don't know what the fuss is all about. I feel fine. Will you just let me get out of here? And so I couldn't find anything going on. And I remember listening to his heart, listening to his lungs. He had no fever, nothing that I could find. And he wasn't interested in stopping either smoking or drinking at that point in his life. So I said, treated the scabies, and I told the staff, look, if he doesn't look any better in a couple of days, ask him to come back, we'll take another look. And he came back 2 days later, and we had an old chest x-ray machine at Pine Street. And even though you may not be clinical, this is tuberculosis, about what you would see in a third world country. Okay, and this is a man I had examined 2 days before, couldn't find anything acute going on. And remember, I'm trying to prove to everybody I'm good. And it turns out tuberculosis, that if you put a stethoscope to that lung, you will hear pretty much normal sounds in this context of a shelter. If I had done whispered ventriloquy, I might have picked it up, but it's hard to do that in the shelter, okay? So anyway, he was an index case of what turned out to become ultimately 60 cases of active pulmonary tuberculosis in that shelter, okay? And it turned out to be multi-drug resistant. It was actually one of the first multi-drug resistant organisms, which meant that it required 4 medications every day for 18 months to take care of. And so this was my first, this is probably August of that first year, and I can remember thinking, this is the first time I realized this is not about a doctor and a patient anymore. This is about public health. This is about, these are people that are spreading this all over, and everybody's vulnerable. Turns out half of our staff at the shelter were exposed to tuberculosis. Nobody actually got tuberculosis, but they were exposed. And we then had to figure out, how do you get 4 medications every day for 18 months into a group of people living in kind of the chaos that I was seeing at the time. And this is where I realized that we were working in a village with a lot of help. And what happened is, this is, by the way, I wanted to show this picture because Barbara McGinnis, the nurse who made me soak feet, is a woman on the left. She is probably the one true saint I've worked with in my life, although she would spit if I mentioned she was a saint because she hated to be called that. But she knew every homeless person that was at the shelter, never took a title. She was just a nurse. She wanted to be a nurse, and that's what she did. But consequently, everybody respected her and told her what was going on. So she taught me pretty much everything I know. And on the right is Yoshiko, who's a nurse practitioner that I work with. One of the mandates when we first started working is we had to work in teams, and I'll talk about that in a moment. But anyway, I share this because these are the TB. We used to have films back in those days that used to weigh a lot. Now it's all digitalized, you just do the computer, but we had to chase those films around. But anyway, so what we learned is that, and this was a lesson for me, is that while it looked like chaos when you looked at everyone as a population, in each individual tend to have a relatively ritualized daily routine. And the secret was, how do you learn that routine to get them care? And we learned working with the State Department of Public Health, the City Department of Public Health, outreach workers, our staff and our nurses, that you could actually do it. But I'll show you, this is what we had to do, was realize that most of the people who got tuberculosis while they were in the shelter never came back because they thought that's where you get sick, so they lived outside. So we had to learn how to get on we got on our bikes and had to learn how to find where people were and bring them their medicine each day. And this is Mark, who is the other person on the team with me, the caseworker. Steve will remember, Mark Moletsky. And Ursula was the state public health nurse who was helping us out. But here's what we had to do, and this is kind of interesting. We realized that I used to be a bartender, by the way, before I went to medical school. And there was a bartender at J.J. Foley's, which is a bar not far from Pine Street, where about 6 of the men who had tuberculosis would go every afternoon to have a beer before they came to the shelter. So we gave them the medication, and before he would pour them their beer, he would give them their daily medication and let me know. And then there was a barber in South Boston who used to have a morning coffee, Clatch Lake, and there were about 4 men who came there, and he would, before he'd give them coffee, give them their medication. So we had this sort of thing set up all around town where different people were giving the medication and then reporting to us. And then we would get the rest by running around. So we got everybody treated for 18 months, interestingly, but it was by realizing that we were just part of a big community. I realize now that we probably couldn't do that because in the old days nobody cared if the bartender was giving medicine. Now it probably has to have a license to do it, but it worked. Okay, it really worked. And interestingly, I was in medical school just ahead of Paul Farmer, if any of you know Paul, and Partners in Health. And Paul came in when he was a student, came and hung around with us for a while trying to learn what we were doing with TB. And this, remember, we're 3 blocks from Mass General, or from City Hospital, and 4 blocks from Mass General here. And the strategy we used to treat this TB epidemic is the strategy that they then brought to Peru and Rwanda to use to treat TB in the third world. So we started to realize early on that you have to be creative, and in many cases, inner city medicine is more like third world medicine than it is like first world medicine, although I like to bridge that gap some. But anyway, that was when I talk about thinking it was going to be easy getting into the shelter, we ran into all the complications when the TB epidemic hit. I think we were working about 120 hours a week for months trying to catch up with that. The other real blessing in our lives, which I'd love to share with you, is that the coalition that put the grant together in Boston, and I was still a resident, so I had nothing to do with this, insisted that homeless people themselves had to be involved in the design, implementation, and the governance of the program. So this is Larry, who I love this picture. He lived on the streets for years, and he, for the past many years, has been the vice chair of our board of directors. And Joanne, who is also on our board of directors, lived on the streets for 25 years. She has a harrowing story to tell. She speaks at the white coat ceremonies every year at both Boston University and Harvard Medical Schools to share her story so that the students will understand that there's more than not only the exotic illnesses, but also the social circumstances. And she could blow your mind. But this is what they made us do. They said early on in 1984 that we had to concentrate on continuity of care, which I hadn't really focused on at the time, but they wanted it from street and shelter all the way through the hospital. So I've had to always, by fiat, as did Stephen, be part of the hospital, either Boston Medical Center or Mass General, attend on the wards, teach the students, but be part of the collegial part of the hospital so that we were not seen as a separate healthcare system. And because the homeless people themselves dreaded being farmed to a separate healthcare system. They wanted to be part of the mainstream. The second thing, they wanted us to work in teams, and I thought that was because it was multidisciplinary. But they were trying to catch us, they were trying to hedge our bet. So if you want continuity of care, this was a hard lesson for me to handle. They hated people like me, people who had I was on my way to do something, but I was taking a year to do good work. And once I finished that year, I was going to go back and do my fellowship and do my career. And they resented that. They said, because if it takes 2 months before somebody even begins to trust you and another 3 months before they'll open up to you, how can you leave them after a year? It's just not fair. And they hated that fragmentation. So the reason they wanted us to work in teams was that I could never take care of somebody alone. I always had to be with the nurse practitioner, with the caseworker. So if one of us left, each homeless person would still have a team that they knew well. Okay, and if they called, it would be somebody they knew. So pretty brilliant. And then the last thing was what Stephen mentioned was respite care. They told us we had to set up respite care, which we had no idea what we were doing. And this was the very first respite program we had. It was 25 beds in the corner of a 125-bed open shelter. And it was in a place called the Lemuel Shattuck Hospital. And this is the earliest picture I have of it. And I kind of look at it with some, wistfully, I guess is the way I look at it, because these were different times in 1985. People stayed in the hospital for a long time back then. The average length of stay, if you had open heart surgery at Mass General in 1985 when we opened, was 6 weeks, okay? Now it's about 3 days, 3.5 days. Most surgery you'd stay, like gallbladders, you'd stay 10 days in the hospital, hernias, 7 days in the hospital. Now that's all done as outpatient care. Chemotherapy, if you had cancer and we were gonna do chemotherapy, you'd come into the hospital for a week every month to get your infusion, and then we'd watch you until you were okay. That's all outpatient now. And in that shift, that real, which I think in many ways was really wonderful shift from the acute setting into the more community or home-based settings, homeless people got left in the lurch. They were the unintended consequences of a good policy, okay, bad consequences. So respite care was designed to really fill in that gap. If you, instead of going home where you can have a lot of family support and visiting nurses and home health aides, you could then be taken care of in a place like this. And so we kind of parlayed by the way, the we have this TB epidemic going on, and we opened the respite program in September of 1985. And this man walked in on October 2nd of 1985, and he was the first homeless person in our community to come down with AIDS while they were living in the shelter. And I look at this now, and just as a remembrance that the combination of TB, by the way, all the people that had TB were all not immunocompromised. So the TB was completely separate from the AIDS epidemic at that point. But this was another horrifying scene. Everybody who came down, within a few months, we had, as you know, dozens of homeless people with AIDS. All of them died within months of living in the shelter, and they all died just in unspeakably awful ways. So I can remember thinking the world is coming to an end with this TB epidemic and the AIDS epidemic. But we were able to, over time, move to a much better surroundings. This is a building right across the street from the emergency room at Boston City Hospital, where we now have our respite program, which is 104 beds. We named it after Barbara McGinnis, the nurse that I told you about. It's called the McGinnis House. And it is really interesting place. It's a place where we can take care of people 24 hours a day. There's nurse practitioners and doctors and psychiatrists and all the supporting staff. Looks for all the world like a step-down hospital. In fact, when I go there, I feel like I'm back in the hospital in 1985, because that's what people would be still in the hospital for. This is Ernesto Gonzalez, he was the chief of ambulatory dermatology at Mass General, and he would come there every month to be sure he could see people so we could get specialty care there. And then certain things that you would be familiar with if you've lived in cold climates. This is a man who lived outside. This was a polar vortex. Did you get the polar vortex here several years ago? This was when the temperature in Boston never went above 15 degrees for like 3 weeks. And this man we had been working on to come in. He wouldn't come in because there's all this stuff. The guy in the black thing in the middle is our doctor, Dave Munson, who had spent hours bringing him coffee and trying to lure him in. The only way he would come in is if we would bring in his stuff. We had to get a flatbed truck to go pick up his 3 buggies of stuff to bring that in, because you realize there are some real obstacles to coming in for folks. This was all his possessions in the world. There were lots of living things in those possessions, by the way, so it was a challenge in many ways. But when he came in and we took off his boots, he had frostbite of both feet, and I won't dwell on that, but just to let you know that his feet were just black and necrotic. And so he was walking around, with whatever is going on in his mind on these frostbitten feet, and we had to keep him there for almost a year while they amputated. The other thing that has become a really interesting part of our lives is end-of-life care for people who are homeless. They've lost all the connections to home and families. They don't really know anyone, and many times the only people they know are the people, like the people at Star. It's the people they know, and when they're ready to die, they want to be near you. They don't want to be cast to someplace else. So from that very first week, I learned that when you send somebody to a strange world to die, that's really frightening. So they want to stay among the people they know. So we do a lot of end-of-life care, and this is this picture is interesting to me, and I won't bore you with the story, but it's an 84-year-old man with a bad neurological cancer who's dying, and his 37-year-old roommate who's got lung cancer that's metastatic to his brain at this point. And they became close friends, despite the fact that one was from a horse farm, that the older guy was worked in the racetrack for years, never left the racetrack, and the younger man was from an urban inner city thing. It was just an interesting and wonderful relationship. They both died within about 3 months of this picture. The old man, this is him working at the racetrack, and I should have, didn't realize this slide was going to be here, but his name was Tommy. He was 84 years old. He had been in the racetrack since he was 15. He never left the racetrack. It was a confined walls. That's the world he knew. He asked, please, could he just be buried in the same place where they dumped the manure, the buckets that he used to take care of? And he took care of the horses for all these years. The woman on the left is a horseman. And as we had a clinic out there. Turns out, I don't know if you have a racetrack around here, but we didn't know this, but thoroughbred racetracks, with all the pageantry they have, the people that take care of the horses live in the back barns, the back stretch. And they're essentially homeless migrant workers who get paid under the table, get no rights, don't have any health care, don't really even have any stature. And we can't get them to come to clinic, because if they come into clinic for an appointment, they lose their day's wages, and more often than not, they also lose that job because somebody else is trying to take it. And I was stunned when we first met these folks, because most of them would not take a handout. They were just hardworking, worked 16 hours a day. And they would never come to you complaining of something minor. They always came to you when something was broken or something. They just didn't complain. And most of them were sending half of whatever they made back home to their families in Central and South America. And they were grateful for that. So every time I went to advocate for better conditions for them, they would beg us to be quiet because they did not want to jeopardize what they had. Really frustrating thing. This is our nurse doing rounds, as you can tell at the thing. But what would happen is Tommy, as he was dying, and this is Tommy and Byron, the same two roommates, Byron would bring him in a wheelchair to see the horses as his once a week get out of the thing. And it was just touching to watch. This was him when he came, and this was he'd come off the van, and all the horses would be in the stables there. And as he came off, the horses would all go crazy because this was the guy who took care of them for all these years, and they missed him. And so this is a filly that took a particular liking to him, but this is how Tommy chose to die. And then one picture that has been very profound for me to share with you. So this is a woman who called herself a bag lady, and she always was in tatters. She lived downtown on a stoop near the train station, and the way she kept you away was to put the smelliest stuff around her she could. She used to get milk bottles that were weeks old. She would have eggs that would become just rancid, and then dirty clothes all over. And that was her defense against the world. It was really effective. And the problem was that she was a heavy drinker, and she got hepatitis C early on from a transfusion at the hospital. Kept drinking and then went on to get cirrhosis, and now is going to die unless she can get a liver transplant. And that's a hard thing to do in our part of the world. You have to pass muster to be on the list. But we got the transplant surgeons to agree if she would come to our McGinnis House and show 6 months of sobriety and 6 months of what they labeled residential stability, they would put her on the list. And so when she did this, it was really remarkable. And right when she was up near the top of the list, she called me, I was in the building on a Sunday, and she asked me if I would take her picture. And I said, no problem. And I went and got a camera, and she got all dressed up. And up until this point, I don't remember ever taking a picture of anyone's face, okay? It was always, I would take pictures of clinical things for students and stuff, but I thought it was kind of voyeuristic to take pictures of faces or, whatever, and it was my own paranoia here. But so she got all dressed up. I don't know if you can appreciate that. She's got lipstick on, her hair's in a bun, she's got fingernail polish on. She went out and picked some fresh flowers and put them in a styrofoam coffee cup right on her bedside table. And so I took the picture and I printed it out and put it in a cheap frame. And I went into my oncology frame because I said, you know what, she's scared to death of dying. She's facing this huge operation. She's worried about dying and wants to have a picture for herself. So I gave her the picture and I said, hey, do you want to talk about anything? Are you worried about dying, about the operation? And she looked at me and kind of laughed in that gentle way and said, look, are you kidding me? I've been out in the streets for 28 years, every night facing death. Death is ever present out there. I'm not afraid of death. I'm so sorry. I'm not afraid of death at all. She said, however, and this is what blew me away, she said, I have 2 daughters. One was 3 years old and the other was 5 years old when I last saw them. She said, I don't know what's happened to them, but I'm worried that if they ever decide they want to go find their birth mother, I want to be sure there's a picture of me looking not like a bag lady, but looking as something they can be proud of, right? And it takes your breath away, oh my God. So what she taught us is that experience of illness and suffering and facing death when you've lost everything, when your connections to all the people you really care about are gone. It's a very profound experience that few of us, including myself, have any clue what's really going on. And I remember working for a very short time in Haiti and thinking about I'd never seen such poverty. But I remember when people came into the hospital or came into the clinic, they came with their families and there were kids running around. There was a sense of, it was abject poverty, but people were together. And I would submit that we've never seen such lonely poverty as we see in inner city urban settings with homeless folks. It's the loneliest poverty you can imagine. But anyway, the sort of funny thing about this, when I came back I gave that tour on a Sunday and I came back to the McGinnis House on Tuesday, there were 22 people who asked me to please take their picture, okay? And now if you come to our McGinnis House, we have portraits up on the walls. For people, I think there's something in it that was completely contrary to what I was trying to protect privacy, but many of them are just looking for something that represents themselves as human beings, as people they could be proud of. And so now we actually have to scramble. Sometimes when somebody's admitted that doesn't have the picture up there, we have to go find one and get it up there. So go figure, it's not at all what we're expecting. So, where am I, by the way, on my thing here? I was trying to make sure I stayed at time here, so I've got a few more minutes. So wanted to concentrate on the people living on the street just for the last bit that we are, who I spend most of my clinical time, as Stephen mentioned. And this is a picture that was taken with a throwaway camera by Keisha, who is has been a patient of ours for years, who lived under the Longfellow Bridge, which is this really interesting bridge for those of you who've lived in Boston. We call the Salt and Pepper Bridge. And she lived up in the rafters underneath that over Storrow Drive. But she took this because these are her street friends. And this was the fall of 1999, just before the turn of the century. I remember Y2K was a big deal at the time. And she took it, and there's a bunch of men. As it turns out, we know them all. They're all street folks that we take care of. I think their average age in there is about 36 years old or 37 years old. And I didn't know she had taken that picture until 5 years later. She was going in for surgery, and she gave me her stuff and said, would I mind it for her? And I looked at the picture. I said, oh my God, where'd you take that? And she told me about it. And 5 years later, when I was looking at this picture, okay, there was only one of those people still alive. One, okay? And what is striking is that because this was Massachusetts, and you have to hear this is Massachusetts, not Canada, we had started, it was under Romney care back in 1996. All of these men and the one woman who's bending over there have insurance. They have full insurance, Medicaid, because we had started that journey back then. And so they're all insured. And second of all, this is a park on the grounds of my hospital. This is a park on the grounds of Mass General Hospital. So we had to look at this picture and come to grips with the fact that here are a bunch of people, really young, dying at a rate higher than we know of any other subgroup in America. And they're insured, and they're on the grounds of our best hospitals, but dying. What are we doing wrong? What's the discord here? And I think most of the last 15 or 20 years now, we've been trying to struggle with how do you deal with that? One of the things we've been doing is we've with the help of the Department of Public Health since 1986, there's been a van in Boston that is run by Pine Street Inn, the shelter I was telling you about. A van goes out every night from 9 at night till 5 in the morning, every night of the year. And these are the folks, if I were starting a healthcare system, I'd start with these folks. They mostly have been homeless themselves, most are in recovery. They are just real. I would say they're the original community health workers. This would be an old picture. And they know everybody outside. And the van, by the way, is not a medical van. The homeless people in our board said, no way could you do medical stuff. We don't want medicine in the middle of the night. We want soup, sandwiches, blankets. We want stuff that keeps us alive. So, and I've been riding along with these guys every Mondays and Wednesdays since 1986. It's really been fabulous. But anyway, this is what, we see people who live in abandoned cars. This is the coldest night of the year when we had 9 feet of snow in 6 weeks a couple winters ago. Still about 150 to 200 people sleeping out, even in those snowstorms. This is an old picture of Storrow Drive between Fenway Park and the river. This is the ramp going to Storrow Drive, and up under those rafters live about 40 people. You'd never know it driving by. I had driven by this on my way to work for years, never noticed this. But if you look up here, you can see that there's boards across the I-beam, and people crawl up and live on the boards supported by the I-beams. And it's up away from traffic and from sight. It's away from, you don't get wet in the rain, but it's a dank, cold, and really kind of dangerous place to be. This is a 92-year-old woman who we tried to lure in. She slept outside for a whole year right on this bench. We were trying like crazy to get her in. And then sometimes there are people that we just can never connect. I've known this man now for 10 years. I have no idea what his name is. He will politely say hi, but never say anything else. And at some point, we don't know what the right intervention is. And then this is where I wanted to embarrass Stephen a little bit, because the mortality among homeless populations is one of the few things that has been studied pretty well. And the results are really sobering, okay? So this is a picture, Stephen, I can't remember who this man was. Believe it or not, this is Dr. Wong, who was working at Long Island Shelter, the City of Boston shelter in the middle of Long Island. And I'm assuming this is a man who is really deaf, Charlie. And Stephen, in his inimitable creative way, thinking out of the box, just turned his stethoscope around and talked to the man this way. And I want you to notice the smile on that man when he finally hears what Stephen's saying. It's actually really cool. But anyway, Stephen did several studies on mortality among homeless peoples that have really have really been the benchmark throughout the country ever since then. And Stephen looked at all the people who had been seen in our clinics, matched them against death records, and came up with mortality rates for different things. So it's a very complicated thing, but basically, if it's fair for me to summarize, homeless people in Boston anyway, and as we've looked around the country about the same, on average die at 4 times the rate of someone the same age who's housed in that city. And with it, there are differences in certain things, but that's about it. Stephen also looked at the risk factors for death on this, but so we realized that this is a population that is dying. As it turns out, the street folks have the highest crude mortality rate of any population we know in America. So the only approach we could think of was to really devote a team to trying to get out of the clinics and out to see the people on the streets. By the way, in our program, we have clinics, we have clinics in about 45 or 46 shelters around town, all the adult shelters, family shelters, and it's a pretty well-coordinated set of clinics. We have our doctors and nurse practitioners, et cetera. And I think it's a terrific thing. But we realize that people who don't come into the shelters, and we have about 3,300 shelter beds, but then there's about 300 to 400 people who stay outside all year long, despite the fact they could go into the shelter. And so you can imagine the reasons are always complex. So this was a team that we were able to assemble back this was in 2009 that I think we took this picture. But Jim Bonner on the left is a full-time psychiatrist who works on the street, and his population, his panel, is the people living on the streets with us. And Romy's our AmeriCorps worker, caseworker. Dave in the sweater is an internist who had just finished his training at MGH and came full-time with us. Suzanne's a nurse practitioner, and Stephanie's our nurse, and myself. And our job was to share equally in the care of the people who lived outside. And we sort of assumed anyone who lived 6 months on the streets or longer was really some people we should be following. So what do? We just go out, we have the nighttime, we're out at nighttime trying to do whatever we can, but then we started doing the daytime as well, because that's when you have connections you can make. And this is trying to get somebody into detox at that time. We'll see people down in the subway. And then we got challenged by our nurse practitioner and our physician assistant at the time about why do doctors think that why do we think that everything has to go on inside an exam room? And that we just so used to that. That's where we feel comfortable. And they challenged us to say, think about what goes on in your exam room that couldn't go on at a Starbucks coffee shop, okay? And challenge me if you're wrong, but we came to realize it's about 80% of what goes on could be done somewhere else. You do need the privacy for certain things, but most things you don't. So we started realizing maybe we've got to stop thinking about street care as kind of episodic and first aid care and think of it as primary and continuity of care. And so that's how we decided to approach it. And this is Dave, who sees this woman who's now 86 years old. She has heart failure for the last 10 years, and we've been caring for her right there at the train station because she will not come to the clinic. But she will let us weigh her, she'll let us draw her blood, she'll let us give her medications, and we can do pretty much, and we can examine her. So we can do pretty much the stuff you would do in the clinic for most things. We've had to bring her to the hospital when she couldn't breathe a few times, but outside of that, we've been able to manage her, and she still hasn't moved. But I once would have told you impossible to do. And this is for the psychiatrist here, which you probably already know, and I was a little nervous about, but this is Jim, our psychiatrist, who used to run mental health centers in Rhode Island, and is a Harvard psychiatrist. And he now has been on our team, and he's learned that most of the people outside don't come into the mental health system because it says mental health or psychiatry or something, and they don't think they have a disease. So what he's learned is he just sees them wherever they're willing to have a cup of coffee. And this is a woman he's been seeing now for 10 years, and I'll show you a picture of her in a little while. And they do all he does his therapy and his prescribing and everything right there at McDonald's. And she much prefers that because it's right by where she is now working. And he's found that it's been a renaissance in his life, that he now has a new way of looking at psychiatry. The other thing that's made it really interesting is not only going out there, but we've learned we go out there together since we're all full-time. So instead of me seeing someone and saying, I got to refer you over here, or Dr. Bonner seeing someone saying, I need to refer you to we're all together. So this is a great picture it's a picture that I love because it's a man who has a spot on his lung, which is probably a cancer, but we don't know what it is until we get a piece of tissue. You have to stick a needle in there and get it, and he is too paranoid to have us do that. So this is sitting at another McDonald's down by where he works in the open market, and that's Eileen, our other psychiatrist, with Pat Perry, who is our internist, and the person you can't see there is our nurse. And they would meet him there several days a week for several weeks, trying to talk to him about options. And Eileen's pretty good at getting through the paranoia and stuff like that. And he finally agreed to let us do that, with the promise of a lot of benzodiazepines, by the way. But so we were able to get the tissue, and it turned out to be, it was lung cancer. We knew what to treat it with. He had the surgery. And this picture is now 9 years old, so he's made it through. And I realized that if we had been working separately, we would never have been able to do that. So I'm a big fan of integrating care, but integrating care in the way that you are both there. It's not integration that you're all in the same building, but integration so you're both sharing in the care of different people. And then the last thing we had to learn on the street was, why don't we look at quality measures the same way we look at them everywhere else? And I realized at that time our mammogram and pap smear rate among the women living on the streets was basically 0. But was that was that us or was that them? And what we learned is that as they got to know people on the street, and if this is Jill, our physician assistant there, as they got to know her, and Jill could say, when you're in the hospital, do you mind if I do a pap smear? And they would almost always say yes. And when they get admitted to the hospital, we learn that's a time to do the mammogram while they're there for their pneumonia. And so now we have the same rates of pap smears and mammograms for street women that we do for the rest of the women in our program. And we realize it's all about personal relationships, just like the nurses were saying way back in the beginning, okay? And this is flu shot season. We learned that we give everybody a flu shot, everybody gets a pneumavax. You just do it as if it's part of your primary care out there. And then the last thing I'd share with you on the street is we learned some technology. I was laughing when Stephen was talking about the electronic medical record. I knew that we needed one, but I am a Luddite when it comes to electronics, so I needed a lot of help from people. So don't think of me as someone who's I just knew we needed better coordination of care, and that was the way to do it. But this was a man who'd been in emergency rooms 5 times in the last 2 weeks. He's really upset with doctors because they couldn't do anything to help him. He knew he had scabies. They kept treating him for scabies. It didn't get any better, and he's living under a bridge. And we brought him into a little room in a church nearby, and he let us take a picture of this. And I was looking at this, as you can, for those of you who can see, I don't know how well, it looks a little bit like what we call Norwegian scabies, except for if you look at where his neck is, he's got these nodules in his neck, and that's not scabies, that's something else. I didn't know what it was, so we sent this. This was the first time we actually took a picture with, I want to say it was a phone, but maybe we took a picture and we sent it by email to Ernesto Gonzalez, the dermatologist. And it turns out, you probably know, our dermatologists can make an accurate diagnosis about 90% of the time with a good picture. They need the other 10%, they need to do biopsies and other stuff. So I got this email back from Ernesto, within minutes actually. And he had been my teacher when I was training. I would do some ambulatory dermatologist. And I got this really harumph email about, we went over this 100 times. And I don't know if any of you doctors in the audience know what this is. I didn't, but it turns out to be nummulopsoriasis. It's not scabies. And he told us what to do to treat it. And then, a month later, this is what he looked like. And he now thinks we are the best doctors that ever existed, okay? And that was all sort of, a specialty appointment by electronic. And we're now working on different ways you might be able to do that to avoid the appointment never works, but maybe we can do it in real time. And then the last thing that we had to put together, as I'll finish right up here, is that, and this is why my passion is what you have been doing here in Toronto for so many years with St. Michael's, is that we can't do care in the community without the hospital being the real support. Okay, and we realized this is a really sick population. We thought we were great getting out to see them, but once you see them, you can only care for them if you have the support of the hospital. And I've rarely seen it done the way you do it here. In a few places in the US, we have our hospitals doing it, but mostly they're looking toward other populations and not the vulnerable inner city population. So I think that is why I love what you're doing, by the way. But Mass General has allowed us to have a clinic for street people on Thursdays. I have to go back and do it on this Thursday. And it started about 20 years ago when we realized how awful the outcomes were for homeless people. By the way, I didn't tell you how often that group was using the emergency room, but it was literally 18,000 emergency room visits for the first 119 we looked at over 5 years. So we have a clinic that they give us a special waiting room. This is our nurse just checking people in. If you have good eyes, you can see that somebody's sleeping under the table, and you can realize that the waiting room is pretty chaotic because people are coming right off the street. The hospital gives us coffee and donuts and stuff in the morning, and then we provide lunch at lunchtime. And then we were wondering whether anyone would come, and it turns out people come. I mean, I was telling Stephen, we saw 100 people in our clinic, street clinic, last Thursday, and that's probably average. So they come, but they come not because it's Mass General, they don't care that it's Mass General, but they come because it was Suzanne or Jill who saw them out on the street and said, will you come see me on Thursday? Or I can see somebody in the van, like this is a woman I saw on Wednesday night in the van, worried to death about her. She has diabetes, her hemoglobin A1C is 19, she won't come in, and I'm trying to figure out how to lure her in. But this was Wednesday night on the van, and I said, just come see me Thursday morning, and she actually did. This is her coming in that morning, and that's Stephanie just grabbing her up and saying, we're going to take care of her. You know, and to make to frame shift 10 years, she's now in a nursing home doing really well, but it took, 10 years of just nursing her along and being able to make things comfortable for her. And then I have a couple of stories, but I'm going to, in the interest of time, skip over these. I just want to tell you this one story that has kept me up at nighttime. So this is a couple who I met several years ago. They lived in a tunnel right under Copley Square. It turns out Copley Square is a main part of Boston, but there's an entrance to the Mass Pike, and then there's an Amtrak line, and then there's a subway line. So there's a series of tunnels right under the main part of the city where a bunch of people live, and it's dark and difficult down there, and there's a lot of drug use down there. It's pretty tough. But Katie, who's 18 in this picture, was with her boyfriend Bo, and they were living down there really struggling with cocaine, and Katie's pregnant for the first time in her life, and so we went down there trying to lure her out, just whatever we could do to get her out to take care of the baby. And she agreed to come to our McGinnis House, and she stayed. This was when she was 5.5 months pregnant. She'd been using cocaine right up until then, but stayed in McGinnis House. We had to admit both her boyfriend and her to the thing. That's the other thing I've realized with hospital admissions. Sometimes you have to admit more than one to bring the one in. And this is the tunnel where they live in. This is a Mass Pike coming off under Copley Square, and if you go down in there, they lived where all that junk is under there. And there's a big light being shown on that to see. But anyway, so Katie has her baby on a Thursday night, and she calls me up around midnight and said, would I please come over? She's got her baby. She wants a picture of her with her new baby. So I went over, and this was the next morning. So the baby's now less than 24 hours old, and Katie looks great. She's beatific, okay? And her boyfriend, Bo, was there. He wanted a family picture so that they could have their family picture. And then Katie said, but wait a minute, as I was trying to leave, because her mother was coming in another 5 minutes. So I hung around, talked to them, and then I took this picture of Katie with her mother and her grandmother. Okay, and what took my breath away was that her mother came over and gave me a big hug, because I used to take care of her in the 1990s when she lived on the streets of the North End. And I didn't recognize her because she'd put on a lot. I just didn't recognize her. But once she started talking, I realized, oh my God, I had no idea Katie was together. And then her grandmother came over and said, you'll never recognize me because I dyed my hair. But I used to take care of her when she lived on the streets in the 1980s, when she lived in the South End on the streets. So I was looking at this picture afterwards and realized this is 4 generations of homeless women, okay? And what is so striking about this is structural, this is generational, it's structural, and you realize we have to change a lot of what we're doing to really get at this. So interestingly, each of those women lost their babies to DSS, which is our whatever, I don't know what the version is in Canada, but and then reunited later on. So it's interesting that they all are together in the same room. Now, what was also tragic about this is that Katie, about 2 hours after I took that picture, Katie gave up the baby, decided that she couldn't handle the baby, and Bo, her boyfriend, convinced her to go back to the tunnel to start using cocaine again. And about 2 months after that, Bo, the guy in the picture, was stabbed to death on Boylston Street in Boston. And so Katie then was left without her baby, without her boyfriend, and kind of then once again fractured from her mother and stuff. And she is actually the woman that was in the picture with the psychiatrist at the table. So she's been sort of engaged in care since then. But talk about living through trauma. It's like really, really difficult. So I think in the interest of time, I'm going to stop there. I'm going to say what our lives is. I could tell you some more stories, but I think our lives have evolved into so many of the folks that we used to take care of on the streets are now eligible for housing through all the creative housing programs that you know a lot about. And our board of directors, which includes So we're like a $60 million a year program, and there are 6 homeless people on our 15-member board of directors, and they are pistols. But one of the things they insisted was once people got housed, we weren't allowed to violate the continuity of care clause. So if they wanted us to continue to be seen by them, we had to do that. So I spend now half my life on the street and the other half doing home visits to people that lived for years on the streets who are now in their own housing. And it's both miraculous and horrifying, because for many people, the skills they had on the streets, which they fine-tuned, don't translate to being all, by the way, in Boston we have mostly scattered sites, so they're in a neighborhood, in a studio, with no community and nothing around. So what you are doing in the STAR program is something that we would love to import to Boston, because we just need to create a community and a purpose around people's lives once they're in housing, because it's very clear to us why the housing is a necessary part of the solution. It's not sufficient. We need a whole lot more than that. So let me close there. I would be thrilled to answer any questions, but let me just say what an honor it is again to be here. And I still am in awe that the Odette family has allowed things like this to happen, and I'm totally thrilled to be one of the members of it. Thank you. Okay, thanks.
So thank you, Dr.
Okay,
O'Connell.
thank
That
you.
was fabulous. Now, a great pleasure to introduce Dr. Lou Odette to the podium.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Lou Odette. I currently serve as the president of the P&L Odette Foundation. As Dr. Sinclair mentioned, in 2013, we provided the foundational gift, or the National Fund for Homeless People. The idea there was really to generate ideas that would address this problem of homelessness in Toronto and Canada and beyond. But not only generate ideas, but have a mechanism to test those ideas. And even beyond testing, we wanted to give it enough runway that we could reduce these ideas to practice, so that we could implement these ideas and see them in place, addressing them. In addition, we provided some funds for this public lecture. And what we wanted to do is to bring in ideas and open ourselves up to ideas beyond our local community here, not just beyond what we were doing in Toronto, but throughout Canada and internationally, beyond the healthcare and social services area. Even I would imagine, I would hope someday we'd find business people or politicians here telling us their good ideas for addressing the homelessness issue. As Dr. O'Connell said, and other people have said today, we're all sort of in this together. So surely this project of addressing homelessness has to find a home in our market society and in our political system. So I'm very happy, and I'd like to thank Dr. O'Connell for coming up from Boston today to talk to us, to tell us his story and to share his insights on what they've done in Boston to address the homelessness issue. And I have somewhere, here we go. So we have a little token of our appreciation, because we really do appreciate you coming here. And it's been a great talk. So this will be a small memento of this talk here today. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I thought there was going to be a photographer, so I was delaying, sorry. I want to express our gratitude to the Odette family for making today and the work of the Star Learning Center possible. Your remarkable track record of giving demonstrates an inspiring vision. Your presence here today demonstrates your dedication to community building and empowering others to make Toronto a place where people from all walks of life can thrive. Thank you for your ongoing commitment and support. And I want to thank Dr. O'Connell for joining us today from Boston, delivering an excellent presentation. Thank you, Dr. O'Connell. And thank you to all of you for coming. to our audience. We appreciate you joining us for this most timely discussion on World Homeless Day and World Mental Health Day. If you'd like to learn more about the STAR Learning Center, we've set up a table of materials at the back of the auditorium, and the STAR team will be on hand to answer any questions you have. Again, thank you for joining us for the 4th Louis L. Odette Family Urban Angel Fund for Homeless People lecture. I know it stimulated me, inspired me, so thank you everybody for coming in for this afternoon. Please enjoy the rest of your evening.